I pulled into the driveway, the engine of my truck humming smoothly before I turned it off. It was earlier than I would have otherwise gotten home, maybe by a few hours. Business in the shop had been slow today, only a few oil changes and a small repair on an old Chevy. I didn't think it would be a problem to close early, maybe surprise Sophia with dinner. It had been a while since we had a moment to sit together, the two of us. Getting down from the truck, the sun was going down in the late afternoon, and a golden glow filtered through the trees, across the house, my house. The three-bedroom house I'd struggled so hard to purchase. I stood still for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the stillness of the neighborhood. It was the kind of quiet that I used to adore. But something had been eating at me lately. Sophia wasn't acting like herself, aloof, perpetually preoccupied. I attributed it at first to her job being stressful, of course, but still, it irritated me. I went in and shut the door. The house was quiet, too quiet. Typically, I'd be hearing the gentle hum of the TV or the ringing of dishes by that point. Today, though, nothing. I was walking down the hall towards the living room when I saw it. A lot. A man's watch, just sitting there on the coffee table. Not just any watch, mind you, this one was costly. Silver band, fat, the watch I knew goddamn well that I did not have. I caught my breath in my throat and stood, looking at it for a second. 1,000 things went through my head, none of them good. I crept on over and picked up the watch. It weighed heavy in my hand for it. The heaviness of it wrung something deep inside of my chest. I put it down and looked around, and then I saw the jacket. On the chair, designer, black, something nobody like me would ever catch wearing. Something was off. My stomach rebelled as I moved in the direction of the stairs, thunder of boots pounding on wood. Each ascent was clogged as swimming through molasses, measured and slow. Whispers and muted sounds I recognized coming from our bedroom were the gentle tides of laughter and the mumbled sounds. Silence suddenly. Fingers hovering above the doorknob before I realized I had, in my ears, a pounding heart. I didn't want to open it, but I have to. I shoved it open in one hard push, and there they were. Sophia, on top of another man. Time came to a stop, the image searing itself into my brain. Sophia's head twisted around to confront me, eyes wide, mouth open in a soundless scream. No. Oh God, no, she gasped, attempting to cover herself. But I was too late. All my worst fears, all the things I'd put on hold, they were all out there in front of me. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My gaze was on the man Logan Pierce. I'd heard of him, the owner of the gym with too much charm, a smooth smile. And now he was in my bed. Fists were clenched in me as fury coursed through me like fire, burning every nerve. I ripped my belt from my waist and assaulted him in a rage. He was too slow to react before I was on top of him, lashing the belt back and forth with all my might, time and time again. He groaned in pain and attempted to push me back, but he couldn't keep up. Each blow landed with a twisted crunch, the belt slapping into flesh as I pounded my rage into each hit. Garrett, stop. Stop, please. Sophia was crying, her voice a shattered wail, but I didn't care. I couldn't tell what she was saying over the din of anger in my head. I'd finished before I even knew I'd done it. Logan lay on the ground, a red stain, trying to groan and roll. I stood above him, gasping, the belt still held tightly in my fist. I looked over at Sophia, curled up in the corner and sobbing hysterically. Seeing her, the woman I trusted and loved, turned the knife that much further. Get out. I growled, my tone flat and emotionless. Logan moaned again, trying to sit up. I ordered, get the hell out of my house. He stood up, covered in blood, as he walked down the stairs and out through the front door. I was about to speak, turning back towards Sophia. Her tear-soaked face was hidden within her hands, shoulders heaving in sobs. I didn't move. I don't know how long I just stood there gazing at her, with it all just coming crashing down on me. When the silence was too much between us, I got up, took her arm, and pushed her to standing. She attempted to speak, to beg, but the sounds did not land. All I could hear was the thump of my own heart, the betrayal in my ears. Silent, I yanked her downstairs. She thrashed, pushing against me, but it mattered not. I was finished. There was no going back now. I flung open the front door and pushed her out onto the lawn, the sun of the afternoon casting long shadows there. Garrett, for goodness sake, just hear me out, she screamed, but I would not. Her belongings, shoe by shoe, bag by bag, I began to push her out onto the grass. I didn't care where it landed. She could have everything, just as long as she was gone. Stop, please stop. Her voice cracked, but I continued, my actions mechanical, unfeeling. When I finished, I stood in the doorway, gazing out at the devastation of her life that was scattered on the lawn, and at her shattered, crying, begging. You destroyed our marriage, Sophia, I said to her, my voice cold. This is your problem now. And with that, I shut the door. 2 weeks had gone by since I had thrown her out of the house. 2 weeks of silence. The type of silence that gets into your bones, biting into your insides when you are left to think for too long. I occupied my time in the shop, served there longer than I had to, but all I did seemed only to leave the weight to press all the heavier upon me. I wasn't sad. I hadn't been sad since then, but there was this other thing, this emptiness. I was sitting across from my lawyer now, in some cold office downtown, as he flipped through pages of papers with hard, analytical eyes. He didn't so much ask me anything, just the occasional question here and there about assets and joint accounts, things I couldn't possibly have any interest in. All I could do was think about getting this done and over with as soon as possible. Under the circumstances, Attorney Walker explained, pushing his glasses up his nose, you'll be in a good position here. There isn't much room for negotiating regarding adultery. I nodded, my fists clenched on the armrest of the chair. Good position. I didn't care if I lost or won. I just wanted her out of my life once and for all. The door creaked, and I didn't even need to see in order to be sure that she was her. I could sense it the way the air changed. Sophia came quietly, once a perfectly dressed self, now a shadow of herself. She was thinner, her face lost, eyes sunken, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. She wore plain clothes, nothing like the neat dresses she'd get dressed up to go to work. Now she just seemed defeated. We hadn't spoken since then. I didn't know if I wanted to now. Garrett, her voice had softened, almost submissive. Can we speak? I never looked up. There is nothing to say. Her chair scraped on the floor as she sat down, and for a couple of seconds it was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Please, she repeated, her voice breaking a little. I did something wrong. I know that, but can't we work this out? I glanced at her then, really at her. The woman across from me was not the woman I had married. She was not the woman who had laughed at my awful jokes, who had shared long nights on the porch with me, discussing everything and nothing. She was a stranger to me now, a stranger whom I did not know. You made your bed, Sophia, I said to her, my tone icy. Now you can sleep in it. She winced at the words, and for a moment I almost felt something. But that flash of feeling was gone before I could hold on to it. Seeing her with him, in our bed, seared through every bit of empathy I had left. Attorney Walker pushed the divorce papers across the table, tapping the bottom of the page. This is your final agreement. If you are ready, Mr. Thompson, we can sign it. I picked up the pen and glanced at the papers, not even reading them. This was a gesture. My mind was already set. With a quick signature, I handed them back. Sophia held out her hand across the table, her hand shaking. Garrett, please, don't do this. We've come so far together. I love you. Her words hung there for a moment, and I could feel her eyes on me, begging. But I couldn't feel anything back. Not anymore. I don't care, I said, my tone level. I don't care what you feel. You destroyed everything we had. She blinked, tears welling up in her eyes. But I stood up, the chair scraping loudly behind me as I shoved it away. Leave me alone, Sophia. I said it, and didn't even look in her direction as I walked out of the office. For good. It was around a month since then when I received the knock on my door. I had just returned from the shop. The late nights satiated me, but not sufficiently to deter me from thinking about it all. I had succeeded in entombing them, and most days contained the memories out of reach where they could not get to me. But when it was dark and I was alone in that vacant house, it was more difficult to keep them down. I hadn't expected any callers, so when I opened the door and saw her there, afoot, Sophia, worse than she had been at the lawyer's office. Her eyes were sunken and dark with circles around them like she hadn't slept in a week. She was disheveled in wrinkled clothes, and her always neat and styled hair was unkempt. What a disaster. Garrett, I spoke hardly above a whisper. May I enter? I didn't move, didn't say a word. I clutched the door tighter and left it a half-width open. She clenched her teeth, her eyes pleading. I have nowhere else to go. I lost my job. My apartment. They foreclosed. Please, I just need a place to live. Just for a moment. For a moment, I nearly played on her sympathies. Nearly. Then I recalled how she was there in the first place, how she'd sunk so low. Think I'd assist you? I asked softly. Come on. She swallowed hard, crying down her cheeks. I know that I don't deserve it. I know I'm broken. I have nothing left. I have nowhere else to turn. I gazed at her for so long. Once, I would have opened a door, allowed her in, and attempted to patch things up. That time had passed. The woman standing on my front porch was not the woman I'd married. She was merely a reminder of all that I'd lost, all that she'd torn apart. No, I told her finally, my tone frosty. You're not my problem anymore. She collapsed over then, crying on the porch, shaking from head to toe as she struggled to keep it together. But I didn't go to her. I didn't even blink. Please, she begged, her voice in shreds. Garrett, please. I turned my face and walked inside. Off my porch, Sophia. And don't return. I closed the door in her face. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table looking at the cold cup of coffee in front of me. I hadn't slept. Her voice, the expression on her face when I turned her down, replayed in my mind repeatedly. But I couldn't make myself feel guilty. Not after what she'd done. I'd made my choice, and there was no turning back. It had been a few weeks since Sophia appeared on my doorstep. I didn't think about her anymore. I couldn't afford to. Each time I let my mind drift in her direction, I could feel the same restriction in my chest, the same chill weight developing in my stomach. So I did what I always did. I buried myself in work and let the days become indistinct. Customers drifted through the shop, their voices a dim hum. It did not matter. I was only attempting to make it through the day. I was sitting in the kitchen one night, having a beer, the hum of the TV playing in the background. It was late, too quiet, even. I considered calling someone, going down to the pub, and watching the game, but the idea faded as it arrived. I didn't have the energy for companions. Hell, I didn't have the stamina to do very much anymore. I took a long swig of beer, gazing into the half-filled bottle. The house seemed empty now, not just because of her absence. It seemed as if the life had been drained out of it, as if all the love that ever resided here perished with our marriage. I didn't even have the energy to set things right. Her belongings were still packed in the boxes I'd discarded, all over the lawn. The lawn where she'd fainted, where I'd abandoned her. But that didn't count, all right? I'd made up my mind. She'd made up hers. I leaned back in my chair, slowly letting out a breath, when something on TV caught my attention. The news anchor was speaking about increased crime in the city, of individuals unfortunate enough. They show us downtown, an area where you would not want to go strolling late at night if you did not seek out trouble. My eyes are becoming tired as I look at the television screen. It was so far away, something in another universe. But then, for some unknown reason, I found myself thinking about her. Where was she, anyway? I pushed the thought away. It didn't matter anymore. A couple of days later, I was filling my truck with gas at the gas station on the corner of the store. It was early morning, the sun just rising, and the world was still asleep. I adore mornings such as this one. Quiet, peaceful. Nothing but the rumble of the gas pump and the birds starting to wake up in the distance. I was there, however, in the cycle of my grieving, when I saw her. I didn't know who she was to start with. Just a huddled figure on the sidewalk, curled forward as if she was attempting to fold into herself. Her clothes were dirty, her hair tangled, and she was gaunt. Too gaunt. My heart dropped, a chill running up my spine. It couldn't be, but it was. Sophia. I stood there, the gas pump still clutched in my hand as I gazed at her. She hadn't noticed me yet. Her head was bent, arms around herself as if she was holding herself together. And for a moment, I nearly left. I nearly turned around and went back to my truck and drove away and left her standing there, like she didn't exist. But something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was sympathy. I don't know. I allowed the pump to home with a click and approached her slowly. The thud of my boots on the concrete caused her to raise her head, and when our eyes met, my chest tightened up. She was broken. There was no other description. Her bright blue eyes were dull, lifeless. Her face was gaunt, with cheekbones standing out against her skin. Garrett, she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. She attempted to stand, staggering a little before she caught herself on the curb. Garrett, please, help me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, my eyes fixed on her, the anger seething within me, familiar as a burning flame. But now there was something more, something that had never existed before. Please, she said again, her voice shaking. I have nowhere else to go. I'm lost, Garrett. I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. I know. But I'm begging you. Her words faltered, and she gazed up at me with those empty eyes, her face running with tears. I gulped, the gravity of it all weighing on me. But I couldn't allow myself to feel. Not anymore. You're not my wife anymore, I told her, my voice level and detached. You're just another error I've moved past. She winced at the words, her shoulders trembling as she tried to compose herself. But she couldn't. She fell there, on the sidewalk, crying into her hands. I don't have anyone else, she murmured, her voice so soft I had to listen closely in order to make it out. I don't know what to do. I looked down at her, feeling the constriction in my chest. But I simply couldn't. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to feel. I walked away from her towards my truck. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. She was still sitting there on the curb, shaking with sobs. And I did not look back. 7 days later, I overheard that she was in the vicinity. It was from one of the boys in the store, a patron who was describing some of the worst parts of town. He informed me that he'd encountered her and that she'd been staying at this dilapidated motel on the outskirts of town. He didn't know her, just some description of some woman who bore no resemblance to the girl I knew. Not surprising, it turned out. Not exactly. I realized things were going poorly for her. I understood that she had nothing anymore. But to hear someone speak of her like that, still gave me a cold shiver. I tried to forget, tried to push it out of my head. But it lingered, like a thorn lodged too deep to be pulled out. It was late one evening when I saw her again at last. I drove down the edge of town, the neon signs of sleazy motels flashing in the night. I had no notion why I was there, but something deep within me knew that I was searching for her. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I had to see this myself and how far she'd fallen. I left the truck on the road and walked along, night falling behind me, the sounds of far-off sirens, cars driving by, and the general murmur of dark voices drifting out of back alleys. And I glanced, and there she was. She was on the corner of a street in something tight and cheap. Her face was caked with makeup, but even that could not disguise the lines of desperation etched into her skin. She was a stranger, one who had been gulped down by the city and disgorged, worn and shattered. I saw a car slowed down beside her, the headlights blinding her in a hard, cold glare. She stooped to the window, speaking to whoever was inside the car, and after a moment or two, she got in. I went away, my stomach in knots. I couldn't handle any more of it. I heard about her last from the same customer in the store. He told me he had seen her again, that she was living in one of those awful motels on the outskirts. I didn't ask questions. I didn't care. But I was unable to suppress the picture of rising up into my head, her sitting alone in the room, selling herself alone to get something to eat. I lay on the bed through the night, staring at the ceiling, the stillness of the house bearing down on me. I wondered at all of her, how we used to be, and I understood something. She wasn't the first one to have lost everything. Days went by, and I couldn't get Sophia out of my head, that street corner, her empty eyes, the way she got into that car. It stuck in my mind like a blot I couldn't erase. But instead of regret or pity, something else crept in, something I wouldn't admit at first. But the more I thought about it, the surer I was. I was glad that she was suffering. It was a mean sort of gladness, the sort you dare not say out loud. It coiled around my heart like a knife, bitter and sharp, but somehow satisfying. Each time I overheard someone say her name, each time her name was spoken, it was as if a small flame of vindication was kindled within me. She had brought this on herself, after all. She'd ruined everything we had. Why should she pay for it? I was working at the shop one day, running through the motions of another oil change, when Tim, a regular of mine, came in, his face splitting into a grin. "You won't believe what I heard the other day," he said, leaning against the counter as if he had the juiciest tidbit of gossip in town. "Met a guy who resides down by the apartments on Maple and told me he'd been seeing your ex lingering around there. Bad-shaped man. Didn't say a word to me, just continued working on the motor in front of me. In there, though, I did experience a spark of interest." "Oh yeah," I grumbled, not even so much as lifting my head. Tim nodded enthusiastically, unaware of the cold not hardening in my chest. "Yeah, she's with that old creep Davis. You know, the landlord. Rumor has it, she's been sleeping with him just to be able to live in that dump of a building. Poor thing, huh?" He laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I just wiped the grease off my hands and nodded. Inside, though, something shifted. Learning that, to hear how far down she had fallen, to hear how this man was using her, it should have done something to me. It should have made me feel something aside from what I was feeling. But all I felt was a sick sense of satisfaction. I pictured her with him, broken, desperate, wanting more than anything to do whatever it took to survive. Part of me, perhaps the worst part of me, was glad she was hurting. She deserved it, didn't she? All the things she'd done to me, to us, to our life together. She deserved every painful ounce of it that she was suffering. She made her decisions. Now she just had to deal with them. Life's a joke, right? Tim continued to prattle on, unaware of the tempest raging within me. She's the high-powered marketing director for the shop, setting up a nice apartment and designer clothes. Now she's just another addict in a crummy building. You lost out, buddy. I smiled at that point, a tight little smile. Yeah, I guess so. I stayed up, sitting in the kitchen, staring at the can of beer before me. The house was empty, with just the soft glow of the small lamp at the end of the room. And it was quiet. Quiet as usual today. Tonight, however, the silence no longer oppressed me. It was different. I couldn't help but think about her again, about all the tales I'd heard of how she'd been thrown out, evicted, crawled to that seedy apartment complex, and only to be exploited by some slimeball like Davis. I pictured her sitting there alone in that dump, battered and exhausted. Her pride shattered, her dignity gone. And I smiled. Not a smile you give the world. A small one. To myself, a smile of justice. She had gotten what she deserved. She ruined our life, so life ruined hers. It was that simple. And for God's sake, it was reassuring to find that for a change the universe had granted her the card she deserved. I downed long gulps of beer, their bitter flavors paling by the bitterness that simmered inside. I had been reminded by chance of that evening when last I had noticed her, beseeching on the pavement, upturned faces streaming with pitiable eyes and teardrops slithering on her cheek. It was nice to know that I felt I'd sent her packing, that I'd resisted, that I'd kept her out. She wasn't my problem anymore. I slumped back in my chair, looking up at the ceiling, and had the strange combination of satisfaction and hollowness churning inside me. Part of me knew this wasn't the best way to feel. A corner of my mind recognized that I should have felt something else, pity, perhaps some remorse, but I didn't. I couldn't. All I could do was feel that small, black satisfaction creeping on the peripheries of my mind. She had ruined everything. Now life was consuming her. A few days later, I learned more about her. The stories were turning worse. Gossip had circulated in town. People would just whisper to themselves about how she had gone so low. How she was doing all these guys, inviting them to that dumpy apartment. How she was poor for something. How she was a little more than a shadow of a woman that used to be her. And the worse I'd hear it, the worse the darkness in me grew that bit more. Each time I heard someone mention her name, I felt as though I was winning, as though I had won. She was suffering the consequences of what she had done, and I was free of her at last. I was drinking a beer with some of the lads from work in the pub one night when she was brought up again. One of them, a guy named Mike, shook his head and whistled quietly. Man, you know about Sophia, don't you? Heard she got evicted from that building on Maple now, too. Davis finally evicted her after she could no longer pay him anymore. Not that she was paying him in cash, if you get my drift. He smiled, and the guys laughed. But I didn't. I simply sat, my drink in my hand, letting the cool of satisfaction slide deeper within me. She was gone. She had nothing. And I remained there. I remained standing. But as laughter was lost, as conversation moved on, something else settled in within. A low, creeping emptiness that gnawed at the edges of that satisfaction. I was glad she was hurting. I knew that. But somehow, at the same time, it felt empty. Such as no matter how much she lost, no matter how hard she had fallen, it wouldn't alter what had occurred. It wouldn't repair what was damaged within me. I put my drink down and got up, making my way out of the door. As I stepped out into the chilly night air, I breathed deeply, trying to shake off the feeling. But it stayed with me, that hollow emptiness, that chill hollowness in my belly. I had thought I would feel better. I had thought it would be worth it to watch her fall. But the fact was, I didn't feel better. I felt nothing. The pleasure was gone, as ephemeral as a summer storm. And now silence remained. The same silence that had hung there since the day I forced her out. Perhaps that was the actual cost for what she'd done. Her pain, naturally, and mine. Because in the end, wherever she went, I was the one left standing in what was left of us once. And that, I realized, was the actual bitter ending.